welcome everyone to this special sort of holiday episode of Beyond the Crucible. I'm Gary Schneeberger, the co-host of the show, and you have clicked play on, we hope you've clicked subscribe to, a podcast that deals with crucible experiences. What are crucible experiences, you ask? Crucible experiences are those things in life that knock the wind out of your sails, those things in life that can knock you off your feet, that can truly change the trajectory of your life. Those setbacks, failures, traumas, tragedies, things that happen to you, things that you sometimes cause to happen yourself. Here's the good news that we say every week when we do this show. Crucible experiences aren't the end of your story. In fact, they can begin to be the beginning of a new chapter in your story. And what we do here is not build a virtual campfire and gather around it and swap war stories about how sad we are. We have conversations here about how you meet your crucible head on, how you learn the lessons of that crucible, and how you move forward and move, as the title of the show suggests, beyond your crucible. The creator of all this, the envisioner who mapped out Beyond the Crucible and who founded Crucible Leadership, is the host of the show, who is here with me as always. I get that wrong every time. I'm here with him because he's the host. I'm the co-host. He is Warwick Fairfax. Warwick, welcome.
Thanks, Gary. Very much looking forward to it.
Listener, you probably have noticed that there's only two voices you've heard so far. That's because this is one of those episodes where Warwick and I have a dialogue about all things Crucible leadership, all things beyond the Crucible. And this one, I said at the outset, is about, it's a holiday episode. Sort of a holiday episode. This is the last episode that we're recording that's going to air before the holiday season. So, because the holiday season is a time where you reflect, Warwick, who is, as he says many times, a reflective advisor at heart, loves to reflect. One of the reasons that makes him a really good podcast host. Warwick has happened upon a subject for our conversation today that we think you're going to both enjoy, and that you're going to be equipped by as you try to move beyond your own crucible. So, Warwick, why don't you let the listeners know what it is we're going to be traversing today in our conversation?
Yeah, thanks, Gary. I mean, this time of year with the holidays coming up, we've got Thanksgiving, Hanukkah, Christmas, New Year. Many folks are going to be with families in the U.S. and just different parts of the world. And as you're with families, it's a time to pause and reflect. And hopefully, I think, in an ideal sense, it's a time to be grateful, to be thankful, and really just to count your blessings, so to speak. So as I look back on this last year, certainly personally, but definitely professionally with Crucible Leadership, I truly feel blessed. And so often life is so busy. I think human nature is such we tend to focus more on what irritates us, or our deficiencies, or challenging relationships, all of which is totally normal. And when a good thing happens, we go, oh, that's nice, and we just promptly forget it and move on. So it takes more work to think of our blessings than our trials. Trials bring pain. Pain forces us to remember and not forget, or left to its own devices. So I think it's a good exercise to focus on how we're blessed in this last year, and don't just skip over it. So that's kind of what we're going to do here. There's going to be some broader lessons learned for, I think, all of us. But part of the springboard is just the sense of feeling blessed in Crucible Leadership and what's been happening. So that's kind of the thought, is just taking stock of our blessings and being grateful.
If I had to summarize the subjects that we're going to discuss, I'll channel my mother's Southern heritage, and I'll say that this episode is all about blessings and lessons. right? We're going to talk about blessings, and we're going to talk about the lessons that those blessings have imparted to us as we look to move beyond our crucible. And we hope, listener, that they'll also be encouraging and equipping to you. An interesting point, Warwick, that you just made there about um, particularly around the holidays. Thanksgiving has passed by the time listeners hear this. The other holidays, Christmas and New Year's, and are coming up. But you you mentioned that we can easily focus on the opposite of blessings, what we don't have, what's gone wrong, worry, those kinds of things. Why do you think that's both so common, and why do you think that's dangerous as we go into this time of year?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think as you focus on your trials, challenging relationships, I mean, for some, gathering with family in the holidays is a blessed event. For others, they look forward to it with dread. Or maybe they've lost a loved one. And so gathering together at the Christmas dinner table or Thanksgiving, it can be a time to remember what you don't have. That loved one is no longer there, a husband, a wife, partner, parents, grandparents. It's all understandable, but grieving is a part of certainly the process. But if you just focus on trials, you tend to get stuck. And if you want to live a life of significance, a life on purpose dedicated to serving others, which is what we're all about here at Crucible Leadership, at a certain point, you don't ignore the grief. You honor those who are no longer with us. But you also have to not move on, but in a sense, maybe honor their memory by living life to the fullest. And part of living life to the fullest is just being grateful, being thankful, because counting your blessings, to use that oft-used aphorism, it does give you sort of rocket fuel. It's like turbo power to help you really contribute to the world. So, it's not just doing it for the sake of it. It's a really important exercise that's both encouraging to you and it can be encouraging to others. So it's a very important thing to do, because if you just wallow in your pain, however understandable it is, not only are you not helping yourself, you will typically not help others. And in the extreme, when you wallow in your pain, not only is it not helpful to you, you might end up hurting other people, especially those you love, which is never what you want to do. Nobody wants to hurt people they care about. So grief is a real part of loss, and I honor that. But you've got to also count your blessings. You've got to focus on gratitude and what you're grateful for. It's just really important to do that.
And as we talk about at Crucible Leadership and beyond the Crucible, this idea of did a crucible happen to you or for you? I think what you're saying there is, can you find things that are positive that happened for you? For instance, I mean, I'll just use my example. As we're recording this episode, my father's birthday would have been tomorrow. He passed away this summer at age 93. It is going to be a difficult day. I can choose to feel bad about that, be sad about that, and I will be. I can live there, camp there, or I can focus on the things not that my father left me, but what my father left me. I can find those learnings there and use those to, as you have said, calm my spirit, center my soul, give me energy and passion for today. Find those silver linings in the clouds, which we urge people to do through crucibles all the time. That applies as well to this holiday season and to not being knocked down by those emotional things that might tug at us, but pushing through them, learning lessons from them, and indeed finding blessing in them.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a good point. I mean, as we're talking here, Gary, both of us have lost our parents. I
Right.
lost my mother a few years ago, 2017. My dad a very long time ago in early 1987. He was in his 80s when he died. He was a lot older when he had me. So it'd be easy to focus on loss, and we'll be spending Christmas here in Maryland, where we live now, not in Australia, and we no longer have the house we grew up in. There's a lot of things we'll never experience. So I could focus on all of that, or I could focus on just wonderful memories of having Christmas Day in Australia and Sydney, which is because Australia's the other side of the world, is typically the hottest day of the year, which is obviously different than a lot of North America. And just think of those happy memories. We all have them. And just to give you one example, one happy memory that I have is Christmas Eve. We would gather in one of the rooms at what was a large house in Sydney, and there was a grand piano there, and we would sing Christmas carols. Well, a lot of people do that, but my younger brother and sister, my parents, we would always have this ritual in which my dad would begin to play the piano with two hands. Now, at that point, growing up, he's in his 60s and 70s. He really hadn't played the piano in, 50 odd years. And he probably was never really that good. So we'd always start off with two hands, and he'd always start off with his favorite Christmas carol was Hark the Herald Angels. So we'd be like, hark, wait a second, hang on. Okay, just a minute, Herald. And he'd be like, Dad, okay, just go to one hand. Eventually you'd go to one hand and then we'd get through it. Every single year, it would always be the same. You start off with two hands, couldn't do it. And so that's a happy memory of gathering around the pianos, singing Christmas carols. And it's a happy memory because it was also comical with the two hands go to one hand. So we all have those memories in our past. So focus on those happy memories rather than the sense of loss. And I'm sure obviously we all have those memories. I'm sure you do too. So focus on those happy memories around this time and why we're blessed rather than the sense of loss.
Absolutely. And moving now into specifically Crucible Leadership territory. Over the last several months, listeners may have picked it up if they've really listened closely to some of the episodes prior to this one, but you've had a kind of a significant shift in your thinking about crucibles vis-a-vis blessings um, just over the last several months. Um, Talk about that a little bit as we then sort of transition into what are some of the blessings that we've enjoyed in 2021.
Yeah, and we'll talk more about it as we progress. But one of the interesting things is we've had maybe like 90 plus episodes of our podcast Beyond the Crucible, 70 plus guests. And one of the things I really enjoy is, we learn so much from our guests. We had a resilience series recently. And, there was a woman, Stacey Kopas, Australian woman, who was injured in a diving accident in an above-ground pool in the suburbs of Sydney. She was like about 12, I think, at the time, somewhere around there. And like a lot of kids, they just sort of ignore their parents' advice, but, don't dive into the pool. It's not that deep. And yeah, sure,
Right.
whatever, mom, dad. She did, and she was diagnosed as a quadriplegic. So that was devastating, as you would expect. She had some substance abuse issues in her teens, but now she is just this vibrant, happy woman that coaches, that speaks and helps actually coach and speak on resilience. And she views what she went through as a gift, almost as a blessing. I mean, nobody would want to go through that kind of crucible or anything, but I think what we've picked up from her and indeed many of our guests is they obviously don't like what they went through, whether it was their fault or not their fault, but they're using their pain for a purpose. They're seeing it in terms of a blessing. So I don't know that I ever would have looked back and said what I went through was a blessing before or a gift. I would say some good things came out of it. I learned a lot. I'm doing what I love. But I think it's been a bit of an evolution in terms of, well, maybe it was a blessing, maybe it was a gift. So, that's certainly been an evolution of my thinking and just the great value of learning from other people. Every human being, I think, has something to teach us, if we will let them. And certainly, I've learned from all our guests, and most recently, I certainly learned from Stacey Kopass.
Since I am your PR guy as well as the co-host of this show, I think that now gives me the right or the opportunity to put out a press release that says he lost $2.25 billion and says it's a gift. Um, okay, maybe we'll talk more about that. Maybe we'll have to talk more about that. But that would be a headline. That would be a headline on
Indeed.
a press release that would catch the media's attention for
Indeed.
sure. Let's shift a little bit now into a more traditional discussion of what blessing is, and sort of the meat and potatoes of what this show is about. And that is 2021 was a pretty phenomenal year for Crucible Leadership, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's interesting. Part of the genesis of the idea for this episode is recently we were discussing with our team, so what happened in 2021? Because basically, in order to start thinking of plans for 2022, standard strategic planning kind of process is what worked well, what could have worked better, what are some of the strengths, what are some of the areas we want to improve, standard stuff that most businesses go through periodically. And that is a springboard for, okay, so what do we want to do, utilizing our strengths, for instance, for next year? Because there's a lot of things we could do, but what do we want to focus on? So as we were having this discussion and going down the list of the things that happened in 2021, it's easy to forget them in the sense of when you're in the trenches, focusing on, okay, what do we need to do today? How do we fix this or that? What are we going to do tomorrow? It's easy to get lost in the weeds and the trenches and day-to-day hustle and bustle of activities. But as we were going through the list of things that happened, it's like, oh my gosh, I do indeed feel blessed. I do indeed feel blessings have been showered on me from my perspective, being a person of faith from the Lord. I have a lot to be grateful for, a lot to be thankful for. And so I did, in a sense, as I was in the middle of that meeting just a few days ago, I just felt blessed. And, obviously, the biggest one is the book, Crucible Leadership, Embrace Your Trials to Lead a Life of Significance. That was, in some sense, you could say 30 plus years in the making from the day of the takeover of 1987. It was probably at least 12 years in the making, as listeners would know. I've often told this story. In 2008, my pastor wanted sort of church we go to in Annapolis, Maryland. He was giving a sermon on the life of David, a righteous man falsely persecuted by King Saul. I'm not David, but I gave a 10, 12-minute talk. Somehow people felt like my story and the lessons learned was very helpful. Hence, at that point, I felt led to write a lessons learned book. It took years to write, and then years to get it published. You've got to build a brand, create a following. And that culminated in a book deal with Mount Tabor Media and Morgan James. And as of October 19, this fall, it was published. Well, that's at least 12 plus years in the making, if not more, depending on how you look at it. And I feel blessed to actually have a book. It looks good. It went through, we went through a lot of some degree, editing, which you were part of, and I feel good about it. I feel like this is a book I'm actually proud of. It's I think it's something that can really help people. Well, when you have that kind of book and it's taken so long to get there, you cannot help but be blessed. Well, you should feel blessed and you should be grateful. From my perspective, I'm grateful to the Lord for making it possible. So that was probably the biggest blessing this year, and that's no small thing to have a book published. So yeah, I feel blessed.
Let me pause here before we move on to tie a ribbon on that mention of the book and also set the stage for what's coming next. It's if you've listened to this show once or twice before, listener, you know that Warwick is not an ego-driven person. Warwick's not talking about the book here to say, look at me, I got a book published. The reason to sort of take this tour of blessings as we've talked about it isn't to spike the football, to use a term you've used offline with me, Warwick. It's to eh, create energy and ideas for growing and cementing the life of significance moving forward. Everything that you're going to talk about here as a blessing, a key moment in 2021 for Crucible Leadership, in that meeting that we had as a team, sparked ideas for things we can do to take it further in 2022. So let's be clear, this is not a, hey, look at me, I had a great year in 2021. It's, here's the things that happened in 2021 that give us energy and ideas and passion and purpose for moving on to give you, listener, more content, more hope in 2022. That's fair, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, there's a phrase I'm sure many of us have heard, having an attitude of gratitude. Uh, there's a fair amount of books that are printed on, gratitude. So it's certainly popular in our culture, but there's a reason for it is that as you're thankful and grateful, it fuels you with energy to take the next positive step, you know? So this book, which would take too long to get into, but there were many positive steps. I mean, I had some great conversations with potential publishers in Australia a number of years ago. That didn't quite work out just because of the market needs in Australia and what they were looking for and what I was looking for. I had a couple of editors in Australia help me. Then, here we had some, and recently more editing. We had a fantastic person help us with the cover design, interior design, great team at Morgan James. We worked together in those final editing stages. The point is, behind this major blessing of getting Crucible Leadership published, there were many blessings along the way. There were
Right.
positive steps that I was grateful for that fueled me with energy to take the next step. Okay, we've got, more of a structural edit. Fantastic. Let's do more of a proofreading edit. Let's make sure we get a great cover design. Terrific. Or let's make sure we get a great design of interior layout. So all of these things, this major blessing was a compilation of many blessings. And so having a positive, obviously a vision that you're off the charts passionate about, but by being grateful each step of the way, it helps make this bigger blessing possible. So your attitude as you pursue it is huge. If it's like, oh my gosh, this is so much work, year after year goes by, I couldn't quite seem to make it work in Australia, oh, it'll never happen, and oh my gosh, it takes so long, and gosh, to go through each chapter, and it was 100,000 words initially, and Morgan James very rightly said we want it more, like 80,000. Be like, oh my gosh, here we go again. What's this edit number 800? It wasn't edit number 800. It felt like it. So I could
I
have
think it
had,
was 807, if
yeah,
I
there you
if I
go.
remember correctly.
So rather than an attitude of gratitude, I could have had an attitude of whining, or as we say in Australia, which is worse, an attitude of whinging, which is like
Right.
whining squared. I could have complained all the way. And what would complaining and whining and whinging and being irritated have done? It would have guaranteed the book never got published. I would have said, it's all too much. Let's give up. But by being grateful and positive, good things happen. So there's some really important lessons in getting this book published. Not just about the book, it's your attitude can fuel the direction of your life, can fuel your success, frankly. Your attitude can also doom you to misery and failure. You want to guarantee that you will fail, irrespective of what other people do. Be grouchy, grumpy, whiny, whingy, and complain every second of the day, and I guarantee you that success won't happen. It's guaranteed. If you follow that path, you won't
And
succeed at anything.
And in crucible leadership terms, not only will success not happen, but the other S word, significance, won't happen. And that's truly a trauma. That's a crucible of and by itself if you're living a life of quiet insignificance, to paraphrase what you quote Thoreau as saying
Yeah,
quite
yeah,
often.
absolutely. I mean, as you say, you don't want to, in the words of Henry David Thoreau, lead lives of quiet desperation. You go to work every day, and it's just everything is miserable. Your whole life you think is just awful. You hate the thought of coming home. You hate the thought of going to work. You might even hate the thought of being alive. You know, at least as far as you can change that with your attitude. You want to. I realize there are some circumstances that are very challenging, but you don't need to make it worse with your attitude. That can make a difficult situation far worse. So attitude is everything, and that's really why we're talking about it. So yeah, the book was huge. There's no question.
But the book was not the only blessing of 2021. What else? Again, a blessing that helped fuel your passion, that allowed you to work in your giftings and your vision. What else happened in 2021 that you want to single out as a blessing?
Yeah, as you're talking, Gary, I think, and as we're going through each of these items, it's important to note that one of the reasons they were a blessing is that, I'm not a take no prisoners kind of corporate executive, as I often say. Maybe it was arguably needed in my Fairfax media days. I'm more of a reflective advisor, a writer, thinker, now, speaker. I love learning and listening. So everything that we do is in line with my design, from my perspective, divine design. We don't do things that are off brand or something that I don't have a remote kind of gifting for, because that would make no sense. So one of the things that, really we've done this year, we started a podcast, I think a couple of years ago, this fall, and Beyond the Crucible, which is what you're listening to now. And we took some significant steps forward this year. For the first time, we had a whole series. We had a 6-week series called Resilience. And really, one of the things that's definitely helped us with is the folks at Content Capital who helped produce our podcast. That Resilience series was huge, to have a series based on a certain theme. They've helped with our marketing efforts to, take our downloads and be able to have our message reach a broader audience. And same folks at Content Capital also have an arm that does audiobooks. And so I was thinking, not everybody does it, but I was thinking I'd love to have an audiobook, and they have a division that does that. And so I spent a week in Austin, Texas in August in sort of a sound booth, and they had a Grammy Award-winning sound engineer behind the booth, so to speak, which is pretty impressive to have that level of quality. And
Absolutely.
so I kind of narrated the whole book. It was a long week, but took plenty of breaks, and I actually, it sounds weird to say, I actually almost enjoy listening to the audiobook, because I'm hearing my own understated passion. It takes a lot for me to say that, but they did such a
Absolutely.
great job. So they helped, take our podcast and the audiobook to another level, and just the quality of guests we've had on the podcast. I mentioned Stacey Kopass. We've had a bunch of others that I've really learned so much from. So I just love learning from people that I knew nothing about. Another example is we had Jason Hardrath on. Actually, I think it's a very recent episode, maybe the
Yeah, just a couple
episode,
weeks ago.
shortly before this. And here's somebody that had an accident in 2015, stopped him doing triathlons and running, but he shifted to mountain climbing, which he could still do just because the way his knee was injured, he could kind of go up easier than he could run on horizontal ground. And he has an ADHD challenge. But I learned so much from him. Because of his challenge, he has a gift, which is he has no fear. He will just try crazy things like, gee, I can barely swim 3 laps of a pool. I'm going to sign up for a triathlon, which involves, like 2.4 mile swim or something like that. And nobody would tend to do that. It's like, well, okay, if I can hit a mile swim, maybe I'll sign up for a triathlon in 6 months. But because of his challenge, he holds no fear. It was like, gosh, I can learn from Jason. This sense of set a goal, but don't have fear. Plan by all, but just go for it. Too many people fail not because they're not going for things, because they're not willing to try. So that had a huge impact on me as I reflect on that gift that Jason gave to me, his lack of fear. He's willing just to go for it, because I'm more plan, think, then stick my toe in the water, then go back and plan and think some more. Now, I'm exaggerating. I'm not as bad as I used to be.
Not much. Not much.
Uh, I'm cautious by nature, fearful even, but so what we've achieved is with my natural, fearful, cautious design in 2021 is nothing short of a miracle. Because you would look at it and say, how could a fearful person accomplish everything that we've done? And we haven't even got to speeches. Speaking of fear,
Right.
I mean,
Right.
oh my gosh. I used to say,
Well,
please go
I
ahead,
would say,
interject.
before we go there, let me
Sure.
rewind a little bit and talk a couple things about what you just mentioned. First, the resilience podcast series, Harnessing Resilience. I encourage you, listener, if you haven't picked that up, go back into our archive and grab the Harnessing Resilience six-part series. Strong guests who have harnessed resilience in a variety of different ways, both anecdotally, experientially, and then also we have some research about what leads to resilience. But one of the things from that show that really was spotlit for us here at Beyond the Crucible was that resilience is it's nearly impossible, if not truly impossible, to move beyond your crucible, as the show is called, if you do not have resilience. And Stacy Kopass is sort of becoming the MVP of this conversation because we've mentioned her now three or four
Mm-hmm.
times. But Stacy says something in her episode of that series where she talks about resilience as um, something that happens where your crucible's kind of like being on a um, a trampoline, and the lower down your crucible takes you, the higher up resilience can launch you. And that was a real learning point for me. So as you talk about learning points and little bits of insight and inspiration that we pick up through the show, I hope listeners feel the same thing. I hope you have your own listener, your own tidbits that you've picked up to help you walk out your path beyond your crucible. But that thing from Stacy about a crucible experience is, think of it as a trampoline. The lower down you go, the higher up you can be launched, was a true difference maker for me in terms of how I orient myself toward crucibles. And then, Warwick, your mention of the
Just
audio book.
yeah,
Oh, yeah, please.
just before we leave podcast and Stacey Kopass and the Resilience series, I think we can tie this back to what we're talking about, because every guest in the Resilience series, indeed every guest I think we've ever had, one of the keys is being their positive attitude. They may have
Mm-hmm.
gone through a season like Stacey Kopass did of substance abuse, of being just angry and bitter, and because it was her fault from her perspective, she was really tough on herself. Why did I dive in that pool? Why didn't I listen to my parents at age 12? But you're young. Young people do silly things. It's part of growing up. Um, but obviously there were pretty bad consequences here. But every guest we've had, from Jason Hardras to Stacey Kopass, everybody we had on the Resilience series, they've had this positive attitude. They've not let grief or anger about what happened to them or the mistakes they've made overwhelm them. Yes, they've had a season to have to deal with that. And you go through pain, there'll always be scars, but they had a positive attitude. They count their blessings. They're grateful. They find a way to find gratitude in the most unlikely places. And that positive attitude is probably the key to their bouncing back. It's key to their resilience, and it's key to their ability to lead life of significance. So you go underneath the hood of every guest we had in the Resilience series, their mindset, their positive mindset was absolutely key to fueling and strengthening their resilience muscle. It's just staggering to me.
And hopefully, listener, as I said, what Warwick just described is what you have experienced listening to those guests along with us. We've talked about some of the takeaways that we've pulled from the shows, from the guests that we've talked to, but we know that we hope, we pray that you have had those same experiences. One of the things that you don't know is after every episode that we record, Warwick and I talk on the phone after we turn off play, hit stop. Uh, and we talk about, what did you think about that? What stood out for you? And it's always amazing because there is always a learning. Never once in more than 90 shows have we had a phone call after we recorded an episode and gone, okay, well, that was all right. See you tomorrow. We
Right.
unpack the learnings that we have had. And we've studied the guests beforehand. So those conversations, again, we
Yeah.
hope continue to use the word of the day for this episode. We hope those conversations continue to bless you. Um,
Amen.
I want to say this before we get into the next subject because you
Sure.
teased it a little bit, your speeches, and I want to set the tone or the stage for you as you talk about the speeches that you've been giving across the country about your book. Um, and I want to say this to the listener. You've now, if you've been with us for any period of time, a few episodes, you've come to a place where you kind of have an impression of Warwick. Warwick's is a contemplative man. He is a reflective advisor type. He likes to ask questions. He listens before he asks questions. Now, because Warwick is the host of a podcast, which is a form of entertainment, is also a little form of journalism. You might wonder, like you do with some people in entertainment realm, is that really who Warwick Fairfax is? I'm here to tell you, what you see is what you get with Warwick. So when he says to you what he's going to tell you about speaking, have that mindset there. Warwick, when he tells you, as he's about to tell you, I didn't start out as the greatest speaker and it was a little nerve wracking for me, he is telling you the absolute, unvarnished, transparent, vulnerable truth. This is something that he had to work at. And when he calls it now a blessing, when he now talks about how he feels as a speaker versus how he felt as a speaker when he started, that is a true movement along the line of a life of significance. So, talk about the blessing of the speaking tour that you've been on, and we'll continue on after the first of the year.
So it's interesting. It's a almost a lifelong journey. I remember at an early age, teenage, growing up in Australia, in my mind's eye, I saw myself taking a leading role in Fairfax media, giving speeches to employees, encouraging them,
Hmm.
making them feel honored, treasured, respected. I just saw myself, just helping them feel like they matter. It was just this daydream as you do when you're a teenager. And so, obviously, whether that whole thing was my vision or ancestors' vision is another question. But I think over the years, if you ask me about speaking, I'd say I'm like the world's worst speaker. It is not my gifting. I'm not a outgoing, extroverted person. I'm probably more introverted, shy. I don't like being in the limelight. I can't like run around with, no notes and just speak off the cuff in some compelling, you know, way. I mean, it's just not me. So I'm thinking, me speak. I mean, it's going to be a heavy lift. It's just not a natural thing for me to be on a stage in front of a whole stack of people. But
Well, let's
yet,
stop here for a
please go
second
ahead.
because
Go
I,
ahead.
I knew the pivot was coming, but I want to unpack something. I'm going to pull
Sure.
the sweater string now that you like to pull on guests
Please, you
because
go
that's the
ahead.
first time you've ever told that story about how
Right.
you thought about,
Sure.
as the proprietor, the head of
Sure.
Fairfax Media, speaking and inspiring the troops, as it were.
Right.
And I've never heard you tell that story. And you tell that story as if you really wanted that to be true and that there might have been a tinge of disappointment that it wasn't. That's the first time I've
Mm-hmm.
heard you articulate something about the failure of the takeover that was sort of a ding to your desire of what you wanted to do. It may not have been your vision, but that aspect of speaking and
Sure.
inspiring people you wanted to do. Did it hurt? Did you think about that through the years that that was something you lost when you lost the company?
Well, there was a lost opportunity because I was so scared and just felt like completely out of my element. We had so much debt, as most listeners would know, after the $2.25 billion takeover. I spent most of my time in refinancing. I was in my late 20s. I was shy. So typically what you do is you manage by walking around. I never walked the floors of John Fairfax Limited, talking to journalists, staff members, how you doing? I mean, I have the capacity to ask questions and be empathetic, but at the time I was too scared, deer in the headlights to do that. So yes, lost opportunity to make people feel encouraged and cared, and I was just so out of my element that it was just almost impossible for me at that time. So yes, there's some sadness. Yeah, I mean, I don't give myself that much grief over it in the sense I was young, I was out of my
Right.
element. I had a great chief executive that did that, but as the proprietor, there was a role that I could play in encouraging people, not managing people, because that was his job, the chief executive, not mine, but I could encourage them. So yeah, lost opportunity. So there is some sadness there, but I was young, and so I didn't dwell on that much.
Right.
But I didn't get to do it. So let's say lost opportunity.
So it must make it much sweeter now that you are on the road and you are speaking to audiences about your book and a book that you wrote. It's important to note, and I don't think we mentioned it here yet, in a lessons learned format. It's not just the Warwick Fairfax story. It's in lessons learned how you overcome a crucible and lead a life of significance. That's got to be even more richly rewarding for you now, having not had that opportunity that you thought about before. So, talk about what's been happening on the road. I know the stories, but the listeners don't know them yet.
Well, I think, part of that too is sometimes, and there's a lesson here, there are things you think are impossible because, gee, it's not my gifting in, being some charismatic off the cuff speaker. But, clearly to promote a book and to get the message out, you have to speak. Everybody that has a book speaks. That's what you do. I mean, there are other things you do, podcasts, what have you. And so, okay, so, we got some help from, one of the best folks in the country, Nick Morgan, in terms of helping us craft a speech. That there are certain key principles for delivering a good speech. We made sure, what's some of the great content we have and how do we deliver it in a compelling way. So I definitely got help. You and I and Carrie Childers on our team, we kind of worked side by side with that to create a really good speech. Had some practice delivering that. Just even as I look back, all of the podcasts we've done, that's been great practice for speaking because I get to talk a lot about some of these principles of Crucible Leadership. So when I'm speaking, it's not like the first time I've talked about life of significance, bouncing back from adversity. Yeah, I talk about that every podcast. And so all of these things in hindsight were building blocks that led me to feel like, okay, I can do this. I've got a great speech. To a certain degree, it's an extension of the podcast. We deliver in a couple different formats, more of the interview style where you, Gary, interview me for smaller gatherings and then more of a general speech for bigger gatherings. So we had a number of opportunities this fall, a couple of different universities, one faith-based, one more general, some business groups. And what's been amazing is the reception from both business people and students. I mean, it's amazing to me that we would ship books and sometimes it'd be like, well, you'd not be disappointed if all of them don't go because students are busy. All of them went. And, we have a moment in the general speech in which we hand out cards and pens and we ask the audience, so, talk about a vision that you're off the charts passionate about. Talk about what your life significance is going to be. What one next step will you do this week? Well, the students' heads were down and it felt like 2 or 3 minutes were going by. It's like they were
Right.
writing like an epistle, like a tome. I mean, what's going on here?
Yeah. Yeah.
And it
You
was
had to cut them off to
no.
continue.
And then we have a time where you kind of lead the question part of it, and the questions they asked. I mean, they got what I was going through. They would say, they might have even say, do you view now your life as a blessing that, maybe it worked out for the best? One person even said or asked, when you go back to Australia, is it painful? Well, yes, it is. Not as painful as it used to be. But you've got to have been listening very closely to get the fact that it's painful. That was an incredibly good question. So, and then at the end, one venue we're at, all of the books went, and I don't know, stacks of people signed up to get a book, and there was a line, seemingly a mile long, for students in one location at the end of the day wanting me to sign the book. It was
Right.
blew my mind. I mean, it was just so the reaction by all folks, business folks, but certainly students. It's like it felt like this book mattered to them. My story, the lessons learned about leading a life significance. As we say often, you're not defined by your worst day. How you can get over that worst day and just live a life, a significance, a life on purpose, dedicated to serving others. I mean, it was such a blessing to see that my book was helping people. And the questions they were asking, they were engaged. For like students, when you would ask them what one next step, so many of them said, I'm going to talk to my mom or dad this week. I'm going to tell them what I'm thinking of.
Right.
I mean, that when a student says that, they don't talk to mom and dad about everything. You talk to mom and dad when it really matters, about something you really care about. So it was such a blessing and I can honestly say I'm not the world's worst speaker. I think I can say I'm competent, maybe even good. And for me to admit that I'm good at speaking, it's a miracle. It makes no sense, given that this is not my area of strength. It just goes to show you that anything's impossible if you're passionate enough about what you're doing and you care enough about helping people. Anything's possible. I mean, it's a miracle that I can get to competent, if not good, at speaking. It makes no sense. It's a miracle. I am absolutely grateful, and I absolutely feel blessed. It blows my mind.
2 points, actually three. First point, not necessarily a miracle. You worked hard at it. So, second point, you mentioned earlier in this episode Jason Hardrath and
Mm-hmm.
your appreciation for Jason through his crucible and his athletic career. That he seemed to have no fear, that he just was like, okay, I'll figure it out. And he just
Mm-hmm.
pushed ahead and he was not immobilized by fear. I've watched you as you've embarked on this journey to craft a speech, prepare to deliver a speech, deliver it. You've done the same thing. You've not been afraid. You've not been slowed or stopped by fear as you've moved forward to do that. And there's a pivotal moment that I want to bring to listeners' attention. You were practicing the speech. It was me and Carrie Childers, who you mentioned
Mm-hmm.
earlier, your speaking agent, and a friend of ours. And you were performing the speech. You were giving the speech to me and Carrie as your stand-in audience. And every other time, as you're telling the story of the takeover bid, every other time you'd ever talked about it on this show, in other people's podcasts and interviews, in conversation behind the scenes, you always referred to yourself as a failed media mogul in context of, most
Mm-hmm.
often in the context of when you were asked to give a speech at church about the life of David. You told your story in the context of a sermon series on the life of David, and you said it moved people, and your line was, and I don't know how it moved people. There weren't a lot of other failed media moguls in the audience. As you were delivering the speech to me and Carrie, out of your mouth, and I listened for it more than once to make sure it wasn't just a change that happened because you changed
Mm-hmm.
your tune once. You stopped saying failed media mogul, and you said, I don't know how it moved so many people because I looked out in the congregation and there weren't any other former media moguls. And I listened, and you said it once and twice and three times, and you've continued to do that. And to me, that was an enormous sign that not only were you not afraid, but you had grown in confidence in delivering that speech. And more than just delivering the speech and talking about that time in your life and how you've moved on beyond it, how you're living a life of significance, you were walking around in that, not feeling cocky, feeling confident and comfortable in your skin. And that's why you stopped, in my view, that's why you stopped defining yourself as a failed media mogul, but as a former media mogul. Because the truth of the matter is, you were in charge of John Fairfax Limited for 3 years. It did go into bankruptcy eventually, but you were still a media mogul for 3 years. That to me was a pivotal moment in how comfortable you became in sharing that story for, again, a lessons learned format. Is that a fair observation?
Absolutely. Well said. I mean, it's a sign of inner healing, of coming to terms with things and shifting my inner mindset from fail to former. It's a very astute point. And, I think as I look back at speaking, it's funny, Jason Hardrath and I couldn't be more different. I mean, obviously he
That's
has 80,
true.
he has ADHD, he's fearless. I'm a cautious planner, think, step, think again. But yet, and I sometimes overdo my, you know, parody almost of myself, because coupled with fear and caution, I have, in fact, I once went to somebody to assess me years ago, and they said I had like almost off the charts perseverance. I mean, extremely high. And that is true.
Hmm.
I have very high perseverance. I'm a person of obviously deep faith, at least I like to think, and deep conviction. So once I decide this is important, it's not about me, it's helping others, and I'm convinced that I need to do something, 99% of the time it'll get done because my conviction and my perseverance overcomes my innate caution and my innate inertia. And I can be detail orientated when I want to be. So once I decide to do something, I hate things not getting done. It's a part of my DNA. So once I decide to do something, it and each step will tend to happen. And so we often have different parts of ourselves almost at war within our souls, or so that's part of what happened is trust the process, trust the team. And because it was so important for me to get my message out and to help people, to help business folks and students, that inner conviction, this is important, I need to find a way to do this. And I also felt like, look, even if I deliver it poorly, and this is some of this, the reason I'm saying this is I think it can help the listener. Even if I give my speech badly or poorly, the innate story of losing 2.25 billion, of bouncing back to lead a life of significance, of focusing on helping others, that innate story is powerful. I know it's powerful, just objectively speaking. So even a bad story delivered with authenticity, passion, honesty, and hopefully a dose of humility, even badly delivered, can work. So that gave me the confidence saying, this is a good message. It can work. Even if I mess it up with horrendous delivery, it can still work, So that gave me
Yep.
just a sense of inner confidence and flow, saying, okay, what's the worst that can happen? It's still got a pretty decent chance of working because of the power of the story, and I'm a passionate person in my own understated way. So that's some of the thinking that was behind the hood. It's like I have perseverance, but I felt like this is a good message, and I've had great help. And so, let's go for it. So that's some of that inner psychological working within you as you seek to accomplish your dreams. This is important work. And the most important thing is if you believe in your message and you believe in what you're doing can help people, that will get you through a lot of fear and a lot of caution. You'll be willing to do things you never thought possible. And you will do better than you ever thought possible because people want to listen to people with convictions who have a message that they feel that can help them. So that's part of what got me through my innate caution is my conviction and perseverance and the belief that this message matters. I want to help people get through their worst day.
Right. That sounded a lot like the captain turning on the fasten seatbelt sign, indicating that it's about time to put the plane on the ground. But I know you're not done yet, Warwick, in talking about not just the blessings that have happened in 2021, but as you said at the outset, this all was birthed, this conversation, this idea for this conversation was birthed out of a meeting we had as a team talking about what we can pursue in 2022. So, what do you want to share about what your hopes are for the next year, what you're thinking of for the next year, what listeners can expect? Where are things headed for Crucible Leadership?
Yeah, I mean, again, I can't help it. I'm reflective, but as I look back, I think if I had to sum up everything we've said, I feel blessed from the book to the printed book, the audio book, the podcast, the speaking. I think there's been another level of healing, both in listening to folks like Stacy Kopass and thinking, gosh, it is a blessing, it is a gift. And when you see young folks in particular, it moving them, that matters to me. It would matter to anybody that's human. There's a level of healing in that. And then not only is there healing, as I mentioned, there's learning. Learning from the people we've been on, from Stacy Kopass to Jason Hadrath. So that's kind of super excited. So I think as we look to the next year, we're going to continue to grow the podcast and seek to grow and have more series on there, like resilience. We'll see what we have to come. I'll be speaking in different groups, from business groups to students. That's our hope and plan. And maybe there's all sorts of different things that you can do, from webinars to online courses. There's a stack of things we're discussing right now, different ways to get our message out in the material, in ways both in the breadth of the coverage of the message, there's also depth of ability to interact with it. And I think as I'd sum up, because I want listeners both to understand our journey and what we're looking to do, but I also want listeners to think, well, what does this mean to me? How can I use this in my own life? And I think it's, be grateful. Take stock of your blessings. Count your blessings. Don't forget them, whether it's family or career. Take stock of that. And, as Stacy Kopass says, there can be a gift and a blessing in your pain. It's hard to fathom in your worst moment, but reflect about it. Is there a way that I can use this to help people? And when you're using your pain to help people, there can be some level of healing, not necessarily physically, but at least emotionally and spiritually. So, and the other thing about the wonders of being grateful and thankful and counting your blessings, that is like rocket fuel to help you accomplish your vision, to lead a life of significance, a life on purpose dedicated to serving others. When you're thankful, your ability to accomplish that vision in ways that are beyond your imagination is possible. So it's not only a good thing from an ethical or moral point of view, it's a practical thing. It will help you accomplish your vision bigger, better, and quicker than you ever thought possible. So count your blessings, be grateful, be thankful. You will both feel better and you will accomplish much more than you ever thought imaginable.
I'm going to grab my carry-on bag and head off the plane. You just landed it. That was fabulous. I'm going to end this episode, listener, by asking you a couple of questions, because we've been talking about what we've accomplished in 2021 at Crucible Leadership and what we're looking to do in 2022. So, a couple of questions for you, and we want your feedback. What would you like to see? Is there anything you'd like to see content-wise from Crucible Leadership? If so, email us at info@crucibleleadership.com. That's info@crucibleleadership.com, and tell us what kinds of content would you find helpful as you navigate your own journey beyond your crucible to a life of significance. And then if you'd like to hear the ex media mogul, not the failed media mogul, the former not failed media mogul, if you'd like to hear him speak If you'd like to have Warwick come to your group, to your um, business, to your classroom, whatever it is, if you'd like to hear Warwick speak, you can also email to info@crucibleleadership.com, and we will get back to you and discuss how we can make that happen. Speaking of making things happen, we are thankful that we made it happen, that you joined us today, that you made it happen, that you joined us today on this episode of Beyond the Crucible. And until the next time we're together, please remember, we talked about it here. Crucible experiences we know are difficult. They can knock the wind out of your sails. They can make you feel like your life is forever changed. And even if it is, though, here's the great truth. They're not the end of your story. It was not the end of Warwick's story. We spent this entire episode talking about things that weren't the end of his story, things that happened after his crucible, things that happened because he learned the lessons of his crucible. And that's the great news about moving beyond your crucible, is if you learn the lessons of it, it's not the end of your story. In fact, it can be the beginning of a new story for you. And it can be the best story that you live, because what the story reads at the end, when it says the end, when you turn the last page, that ending is a life of significance.